detective tales, The Friday Night Club, Detective Agatha Marple's mystery, thriller and suspense. A stiff autumn breeze whispered against the mullioned windows of the old Lantern Inn, carrying with it the scent of distant wood smoke and damp leaves. Inside, the warm glow of gas lamps illuminated a snug common room, where 5 figures sat in languid comfort around a polished oak table. Each Friday evening these regulars gathered in amiable discourse, debating the latest gossip or puzzling over local curiosities, though this night would prove anything but ordinary. Agatha Marple, the quiet but sharp-eyed nucleus of the little group, lifted a slender teacup to her lips. She was not tall, nor particularly imposing, but there was a certain composure about her that commanded attention. She wore a simple tweed jacket and skirt, soft grey in hue, and the merest hint of a smile tugged at her gently lined face. In the shadows, the other members of the Friday Night Club also sipped their tea, or pecked daintily at the final crumbs of Margaret Carter's renowned scones. The atmosphere, intimate and perhaps faintly conspiratorial, was precisely why this corner of Dunsford society had bonded here each week in the first place. The old Lantern Inn itself exuded an air of enduring opulence, made cosy by the years. Once the hunting lodge of a minor noble family, its high-beamed ceilings still boasted graceful carvings of mythical beasts, though the corners had grown dark with the patina of time. Sturdy oak panels gleamed in the lamplight, and thick, richly coloured drapes hung across tall windows that now rattled softly against the chill wind. The effect was at once grand and claustrophobic, a relic of a more lavish era now pressed into service as the village inn. Agatha observed everything through discerning, half-glowed eyes, the shifting logs in the fireplace, the faint ring of silver spoons on delicate porcelain, the hush that had settled after Dr. Brooks, a genial physician with a tendency to elaborate, concluded his whimsical anecdote about a case of mistaken identity in the next county. It was in that hushed moment, like a breath held too long, that Margaret Carter, the proprietress, burst into the room. A collective intake of breath greeted Margaret's abrupt entrance. She stood by the door, cheeks drained of colour, one hand gripping the door frame as though to steady herself. Her dark blue frock, generally tidy, was creased with panic. Agatha set down her cup, instantly alert. "My goodness, Margaret," she said in a gentle tone. "Whatever has happened?" Margaret looked around with wide, distressed eyes, taking a heartbeat to gather her voice. "It's gone!" she whispered hoarsely, pressing a trembling palm to her throat. "Gone from the storeroom! My recipe book!" A murmur rippled through the small group. It took only a moment for each to realize the significance of Margaret's words. The woman's prized compendium of recipes, guarded more zealously than any bank vault, was legendary throughout the county. Its loss could hardly be the work of a mischievous prankster. After all, the upcoming Dunsford Harvest Festival bake-off held considerable prestige, not to mention monetary incentive. Lucy Spencer, a trim young journalist with an intrepid glint in her hazel eyes, stood at once. "Could it have been misplaced?" she asked, her voice fraught, yet seeking reason. "You're always so busy, Margaret. Perhaps you—" "I know exactly where I keep it," Margaret cut in, voice shaking. "In the storeroom cabinet, locked." Her gaze swept the room. "Broken into, more like, and I found this." She held up a small slip of paper, corners crumpled by her trembling grasp. Agatha rose and stepped forward, politely taking the note. The rest of the Friday Night Club peered around her shoulders, straining to see. The paper bore only a few scrawled words. "You won't be winning this time." A taut silence choked the room, broken only by the hiss of the fireplace. At last Martin Lowe, a reserved fellow rumoured to have served in military intelligence, murmured, "Who would do such a thing? Surely the bake-off can't be so cutthroat." "But it is," Dr. Brooks interjected quietly, a troubled furrow on his brow. "A decent prize, not to mention the prestige for any bakery or household, and Margaret's recipes are quite famous." Margaret drew in a wavering breath. I haven't touched a thing in the storeroom beyond seeing the damage to the cabinet. I came straight here." While the others bombarded Margaret with questions, Agatha Marple quietly walked to the hearth, the note still in her hand. She studied the coarse scrawl of the message, as though the shape of each letter might yield a secret. Her calm was notable even among a group that prided itself on rational minds. She glanced at the door Margaret had left ajar. The corridor beyond seemed to deepen into shadow, as though ushering in fresh uncertainties. At last she turned back, tucking the note into an inner pocket of her jacket with careful deliberation. "Margaret," she said, her tone crisp and measured, "please take us to the storeroom, best to see for ourselves before any further commotion spreads. If a crime has indeed been committed, we must act quickly and discreetly." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with a fearful sort of gratitude, while the doctor placed a steadying hand on her elbow. Lucy cast a quick, darting look at Agatha, half in awe of the other woman's composure. Martin Lowe, toying with the watch on his wrist, said nothing, though his gaze flickered with the sharp interest of a man accustomed to unraveling complexities. In a quiet huddle, the Friday night club followed Margaret out of the snug common room. The corridor's parquet floors creaked underfoot, lit only by the glow of a single electric lamp that accentuated the age of the lodge, turned in then. Faint perfume of baking bread mixed incongruously with the tang of dust and time. Their footsteps slowed as the storeroom door came into sight. Ere lock splintered. A sense of sudden foreboding clung to the air like a winter frost. Within moments they would behold the wreckage, an upturned container of salt, or flour perhaps, scattered across the storeroom floor, evidence of a forced entry, the absence of that precious leather-bound book upon which Margaret Carter's livelihood so often relied. The question of why and who would loom in the minds of these villagers, each with their own secrets, flaws, and quiet ambitions. For now, though, the group paused on the threshold, as if unwilling to bring the gravity of the situation fully into their midst. Agatha Marple stepped forward, her calmness a gentle anchor in the swirling tide of suspicion and fear. It was a look that promised thoroughness and impartiality, a methodical approach to unveiling truths. No one spoke, for there was nothing to say. A theft in Dunsford, especially involving Margaret Carter, was serious business indeed. As the lamp on the wall flickered, casting curious shadows across troubled faces, it seemed the comfortable walls of the old Lantern Inn had grown close and watchful, as though themselves unwilling participants in the unfolding mystery. And so, in the dying glow of that autumn night, the crime at the old Lantern Inn was discovered. Daring, disruptive, and certain to challenge the delicate facade of contentment that Dunsford prided itself upon. Even then, Agatha Marple's keen mind was already sifting through the scene, quietly assembling the puzzle in her mind. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the diamond-paned windows of the old Lantern Inn, illuminating a haze of dust motes in the still warm air. Although autumn had begun to strip the oaks and maples of their foliage, inside the inn the scent of sweet pastries and strong tea lent a cosy contrast. Patches of polished floorboards reflected the remnants of daylight, and heavy brocade curtains lent an oddly claustrophobic opulence to what had once been a lordly hunting lodge. At a walnut table near the old stone hearth sat 5 individuals, the Friday night club, who had lingered well past their weekly discussion. Chief among them was Agatha Marple, a woman of quiet composure in her early 60s, wearing a sensible tweed jacket and skirt. Her mild grey eyes and neat silver hair gave little away, yet she possessed a penetrating intelligence all the more formidable for its polite subtlety. They were half in conversation, half listening to the gentle crackle of the fire, when Margaret Carter, proprietor of the old Lantern Inn, hurried into the room, her face ashen. "It's gone!" she cried, setting a trembling hand to her chest. "My recipe book! Someone has stolen it!" That statement shattered the tranquil hush. Lucy Spencer, a spirited young journalist, sprang up at once, nearly upsetting her teacup. "Stolen?" she echoed. "Surely, there must be some mistake." But Margaret, eyes glistening with panic, shook her head vehemently. "I'm certain. The cupboard was forced open. My notes and supplies all in disarray." At these words, Dr. Edwin Brooks, a jovial physician with a kindly but inquisitive manner, set aside his saucer and rose from his seat. "My dear Margaret," he said, his low voice attempting to soothe, "try to catch your breath and tell us precisely what you found." Margaret drew in a shuddering breath and clasped her apron in both hands. "I went to fetch my recipe book to finalize preparations for the Dunsford Harvest Festival bake-off, only days away, as you know. When I reached the storeroom, I noticed the lock on my spice cabinet had been tampered with. At first, I thought it must be a trick of the light, but then—" Her gaze flickered around the group as if struggling to maintain composure. "Everything was in chaos. My notes, my recipes for the competition gone, and the spare ingredients I'd meticulously set aside were covered in salt from a toppled canister, utterly ruined." From her corner of the table, Agatha Marple pressed her lips together thoughtfully. Her eyes, cool and assessing, passed over Margaret, then flitted to the open doorway behind the innkeeper. In that corridor lay the storeroom, now evidently the heart of a crime. Lucy stepped closer to Margaret, laying a sympathetic hand on her arm. "But why? Who would do such a thing?" Martin Lowe, a reserved man rumoured to have served in discreet government work during the war, cleared his throat. The bake-off does bring some measure of fame, and the winner's chosen charity stands to receive a sizable donation. If Margaret's recipe book is as valuable as everyone says—" Margaret's face, already pale, turned paler yet. "I've been runner-up before, but many times I win, and the donation is especially dear this year." She paused, uncertain how much to divulge. "I had a personal stake in ensuring a particular cause received the money. Whoever took that book knew exactly what they were doing." A hush fell, broken only by the popping of logs in the fireplace. The air felt thick with both indignation and apprehension, as if the heavy drapes had tightened the walls around them. Dr. Brooks spoke again, glancing discreetly toward Agatha. "Shall we see the storeroom? I imagine our Agatha might glean something from the scene." Margaret hesitated, her anxious eyes scanning the group. Then she nodded quickly, half in resignation, half in hope. "Please, yes. I don't know what to do. The bake-off is days away, and my best recipe—" Agatha Marple rose in a smooth, unhurried fashion. Though unassuming in her manner, there was a quiet assurance about her that calmed Margaret somewhat. "Show us, my dear," she said kindly. "We will do what we can." Together they made their way to the corridor. The transition from the inviting common room to the darker hall was stark. Gilded sconces, tarnished from decades of use, provided scant illumination, revealing cracks in the panelling like the lines of a careworn face. The storeroom door stood half open, the lock clearly splintered around the brass latch. Inside, the air smelled of spices and subtle despair. A shallow pool of spilled salt glittered under the wan light, a mocking sign of the sabotage. The shelves of jars, cardamom, cloves, cinnamon, looked jostled, as though rummaged in haste. Agatha noted, too, that the floor near the far wall bore footprints in the salt, each impression blurred and overlapping, pointing to more than one pass made through the chaos. "Such thorough vandalism," Lucy murmured, her voice subdued. "It looks deliberate. Someone wanted to destroy as much as they could." Margaret pressed her lips together, then took a faltering step forward. "They took my best brandy for the fruitcake and my brand-new canister of sugar. I only hope they didn't get my notes on the spicing ratios." Agatha Marple laid a gentle hand on Margaret's forearm. "Have courage, Margaret. The world might be full of unscrupulous folk, but they often leave a trail as distinctive as a perfume's signature." From behind them, Dr. Brooks let out a thoughtful hum. Martin Lowe, arms folded, stood near the door like a vigilant sentry. No one spoke for a moment, each lost in personal speculation. In the silence, Agatha lowered herself to inspect the broken lock. She gave a slight tilt of her head, as if to appraise every scratch and indentation. One might imagine her expression to be merely curious, but a faint flicker in her eyes suggested a deeper calculation, the start of invisible lines connecting a half-formed puzzle in her mind. At last Agatha rose, dusted her hands, and surveyed the grim evidence with measured calm. "It may appear a senseless theft," she observed in a tone laced with dry irony, "but in my experience such acts rarely prove random. I suspect someone wants more than a trophy for sabotage. We must find out who and precisely why." Margaret, looking as if she might crumple under the weight of her distress, managed a small nod. The shape of her despair filled the storeroom much as the spilled salt coated the floor. It was a scene of silent violation, of cunning opportunism. Outside, the sun dipped further beyond the horizon, casting a dusky glow through the high windows of the inn. Tucked away in this storeroom, the thick atmosphere of hidden motives pressed in upon them. Without warning, a gust of wind rattled the nearby shutters, and everyone present felt the faintest tremor of unease, as though the old building itself sensed the onset of a dark unraveling. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her temple. "What am I to do?" she whispered, and Agatha Marple, aware that the shadows of greed, jealousy, and fear had quietly fallen over Dunsford, offered the only reassurance she could. "We shall discover the truth, Margaret," she said gently. "One must simply know where and how to look." A hush spread through the storeroom in the aftermath of Margaret's discovery, as though the very walls of the old Lantern Inn conspired to hold their breath. The spill of salt glinted in the lamplight, defying anyone to dismiss the sabotage as trivial. Outside, a lingering dusk gave way to early evening, and the wind sent a forlorn creak along the eaves. It was only when Dr. Edwin Brooks knelt down, his keen gaze sweeping the floorboards, that he spotted the small scrap of parchment, half tucked behind an overturned tin of cinnamon. With care he lifted it as though it might crumble in his hand. "Margaret," he murmured, his voice betraying both curiosity and concern, "look here." Agatha Marple, standing at the threshold with Lucy Spencer and Martin Lowe, drew nearer. A single line of crudely scrawled text ran across the parchment. "I'll make sure you don't win." A shallow intake of breath passed from Lucy to Margaret. The younger woman's hazel eyes flashed with alarm. "So it isn't merely the recipe book," Lucy said in a tight whisper. "Someone wants to thwart Margaret's chances at the bake-off entirely." Margaret Carter clutched the edges of her apron. "This note? It's so personal. Who would wish me such ill will?" She appeared lost between disbelief and an anxiety that threatened to spill over at any moment. Agatha stepped forward, glancing briefly at the tattered edges of the parchment. Her silver hair, neatly pinned, glimmered in the lamplight. She spoke in that measured, thoughtful tone so characteristic of her. "If it were a simple theft, the culprit might have taken the book and left. But this smear of salt, the smashed container, it suggests a certain deliberation." Dr. Brooks nodded in agreement. "Indeed. Whoever did this seemed determined to ruin your supplies in the process." Lucy's brow furrowed. "You think it's a competitor?" She glanced around as though expecting a masked figure to lurk in the storeroom's shadows. After all, the bake-off does attract, well, some passionate contenders. Martin Lowe, who so often kept his thoughts behind a polite reserve, let out a small hum. Passion, jealousy, those are potent forces, especially when prestige and money enter the equation. His words lingered in the cold air, a subtle echo of how the war had taught him to anticipate foul play in even the calmest of places. Margaret, struggling to maintain composure, raised her chin. "I've been baking for that festival for years. Never an incident like this. Nobody's resented me enough to sabotage my livelihood." Her voice faltered. Agatha placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's arm. "Fear and ambition can twist the most ordinary people," she said quietly. Then a wry hint of dryness touched her tone. "Besides, Dunsford is hardly the sleepy hamlet it appears, particularly when the stakes grow high." A muted silence followed, as if each member of the Friday night club momentarily questioned their own innocence, or recollected someone else's small grudges. The wooden walls, once proud vestiges of a noble hunting estate, seemed to loom closer, as though they yearned to whisper secrets of past intrigues. At length, Dr. Brooks cleared his throat. "What do you suggest we do now, Miss Marple?" Agatha's gaze flickered from the note to the spilled salt, and then to the broken lock on the storeroom cabinet. "I suggest we collect ourselves and proceed carefully. Let us set aside assumptions until we can examine every angle. Rushing to conclusions can be as damaging as a thief in the night." Margaret exhaled, steeling herself. She moved to the door, her footsteps leaving faint impressions in the salt behind her. "I'll see to clearing up this mess in the meantime," she said, mustering a bravado that did not quite reach her eyes. As they exited the storeroom, the note still clutched in Agatha's gloved hand, a late autumn chill wound its way down the corridor, slipping through the inn's aging timbers. It spoke of a subtle menace growing in the heart of Dunsford, a reminder that secrets seldom remain silent for long, and as each member of the Friday Night Club retreated into their own thoughts, the riddle of the missing recipe book became less a matter of petty theft and more an urgent puzzle waiting to be solved. Outside, the last hint of twilight succumbed to moonlit shadows, laying a ghostly sheen across the village green. Within the once grand confines of the old Lantern Inn, Agatha Marple cast a contemplative glance at the cryptic note. There was far more to this than mere sabotage, and she knew. Beneath the veneer of civility and the gentle hum of teapots, motives far deeper and darker were beginning to stir. By early morning, a pallid sun struggled to pierce the autumn fog enveloping the village of Dunsford. Narrow cobblestone lanes lay half-submerged in a pearly mist that clung to stone walls and the eaves of half-timbered cottages. Only the steeple of the centuries-old church rose above the swirling haze, a silent sentinel watching over the villagers. Within the old Lantern Inn, a lodge once owned by a minor baronet, lamplight still glowed behind leaded windows, revealing the silhouettes of early risers preparing for the day. Nestled in the inn's snug parlour sat the nucleus of Dunsford's most unlikely investigative cohort, the Friday Night Club. They had gathered here not for idle chit-chat, although that too was inevitable, but to exchange what new insights they might glean regarding the theft of Margaret Carter's prized recipe book. Truth be told, few in the village suspected the quiet assembly of neighbours to be capable detectives, but beneath their mild exteriors lay keen minds, unafraid of challenging questions. Agatha Marple. Presiding over a tray of teacups and scones was Agatha Marple, the gentle force around which the Friday Night Club revolved. Once a librarian, accustomed to cataloguing countless volumes with meticulous diligence, she had an uncanny knack for perceiving patterns where others saw only coincidences. She was a woman in her early 60s, silver hair pinned neatly above clear grey eyes. The parlour's amber light highlighted the fine lines of her face, each a silent testament to years spent observing rather than intruding. She now directed a thoughtful gaze at the cup in her hand. Agatha often found tea an excellent companion to reflection. It provided just enough pause to weigh observations with measured calm. Leaning back in a slightly creaking armchair, she recalled the stolen recipe book and the malicious note discovered the previous night. "I'll make sure you don't win." It still rattled at the edges of her mind. She found herself contemplating not for the first time how jealousy could burrow itself deep into human nature. The faint clink of a teacup against its saucer brought her back to the present moment. Dr. Edwin Brooks. Across from her, perched on a sturdy wooden chair, sat Dr. Edwin Brooks, a genial man in his late 40s, whose broad smile and sonorous voice often enlivened any gathering. The son of a seamstress and a travelling salesman, he had earned a modest but secure standing as the village's doctor, a role he approached with equal parts dedication and theatrical flair. The good doctor's eyes sparkled with curiosity as he recounted, rather animatedly, one of his latest patients who had insisted that a common cold was the dreaded influenza. "I dare say," he exclaimed with playful exasperation, "people do so love to imagine the worst. A simple cough, and they see themselves consigned to the sick-bed for weeks." A wry grin tugged at Agatha's lips. "One must be grateful you're here to set them straight." Box chuckled. Well, one tries, although, he leaned forward, voice dropping in conspiratorial amusement, I might have embellished the story a bit. No harm done, merely keeps the conversation lively. He flashed a disarming smile, which Agatha knew well signalled his penchant for exaggeration. Still, she privately considered that beneath his genial chatter ran a sharp intellect capable of noting small details his patients might not think to hide. She had seen more than once how his doctor's instincts uncovered truths that ordinary folk often overlooked. Lucy Spencer. Seated near a tall window, sipping fragrant tea and gazing at the mist-shrouded village, was Lucy Spencer. Only recently returned from an assignment in distant Morocco, she carried a faint air of worldliness about her. The discreet jingling of silver bracelets on her wrist and the embroidered shawl draped over her shoulders hinted at the exotic locales she had visited. "Nothing compares to Dunsford's crisp mornings," she remarked, with a wistful smile. "I confess I do miss the smell of spice markets and orange blossoms. The world beyond is both marvellous and dangerous, but I never forget the solace of home." Brooks regarded her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "That shawl, Lucy. Moroccan, is it? One of your souvenirs, I take it?" Lucy nodded. "A gift from a Berber woman who guided me through a narrow pass in the Atlas Mountains. She told me that every stitch carried a blessing for safe travels." Agatha studied Lucy over the rim of her teacup. An adventurous soul in a traditionally quiet village was bound to provoke speculation, yet Lucy's open manner made her difficult to distrust. Still, Agatha suspected that Lucy, like many in Dunsford, might be harbouring secrets of her own. Travel journalism was a curious profession for a young woman with an earnest gaze and a taste for curiosity. Where might a longing for excitement lead someone when money or pride were at stake? Shared purpose and hidden threads. Dunsford, cloaked in its pastoral appeal, seemed far removed from the lurid headlines that Lucy often chased, yet a stolen recipe book, apparently no more than local gossip at first, had cast a shadow of deeper intrigue. The slip of parchment bearing that threat, the sabotage in Margaret Carter's storeroom, all pointed to a carefully laid plan rather than a random act. Agatha motioned for the others to draw closer. "We might consider who stands to benefit most from Margaret's misfortune," she said softly. Her unassuming voice nonetheless commanded rapt attention. "The bake-off is approaching, and with it comes both prestige and financial gain, at least in philanthropic terms. Our culprit could be someone local, or perhaps an outsider with reason to undermine Margaret's success." Lucy frowned, glancing at the swirl of fog beyond the window. "Surely you don't think a traveller from another county would come to Dunsford solely to sabotage her? That seems a stretch." Dr. Brooks rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "A fair point, my dear Lucy, though we can't discount the possibility of a hired saboteur, or someone with a grudge. You know how these events attract all sorts of attention. Some folks might do anything to secure a win, especially if they've lost before." Agatha allowed a moment's pause. She sometimes found that silence, when gently offered, invited the most revealing responses. "There's another angle," she murmured, setting her teacup down with a faint clink. "What if the charity itself, the one set to receive the donation, becomes entangled in this? Could someone have a vested interest in redirecting that contribution elsewhere?" At the mention of charitable causes, Dr. Brooks's kindly brow furrowed. He was widely known to champion a small clinic in the neighbouring town that struggled to stay afloat. If Margaret intended to donate any winnings to a rival institution, might that rub someone the wrong way? Agatha noted his expression, her mind quietly assembling puzzle pieces. Lucy let out a small sigh. "I only hope the culprit isn't someone close to us," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "The thought of betrayal from within the village." Her sentiment lingered in the parlour's stillness. Outside, the mist had begun to disperse under a timid sun, revealing the shapes of tall poplar trees swaying along the cobbled main street. But the gloom of suspicion lingered indoors like a second fog, intangible yet stifling. and to investigate. As the three companions rose from their seats, they exchanged determined glances. This was more than a casual puzzle. It was a matter of pride and trust in a tightly knit community. The old lantern inn creaked gently, almost in agreement. Below them, the murmur of Margaret Carter's employees setting tables for the lunch crowd filtered through the floorboards. Dr. Brooks straightened his coat. He said, with the genial air of a gentleman presenting a proposition, "I believe a thorough conversation with Margaret might be in order. Perhaps she's recalled some small detail she overlooked in the shock of last night." Lucy gathered her embroidered shawl around her shoulders and nodded. "I'll speak with a few shopkeepers I know, though it's the merest hunch. They might have noticed strangers lurking about." Agatha offered a mild smile. "Excellent thinking, Lucy. And do remember, apparently trivial observations often prove the most revealing." Her grey eyes glinted with an almost imperceptible wryness, a spark of dry wit that surfaced whenever a fresh puzzle piqued her interest. "After all," she added quietly, "sometimes the greatest secrets are hidden by the most ordinary facade." And so they prepared to set out into the hush of a 1920 Dunsford morning. Agatha with her calm deliberation, Dr. Brooks with his eager curiosity, and Lucy with her worldly charm. Each would uncover new threads and possibly new suspects. They could not have guessed just how tangled the web of motivations ran beneath Dunsford's placid surface, nor how heavily the threat of sabotage would weigh on them all. Yet they pressed on, united in their quiet vow to shine light on what lurked in the shadows, and as the door to the parlour clicked shut behind them, the old Lantern Inn seemed to sigh, its timbered walls settling into uneasy silence, patiently awaiting the unfolding of secrets that had only begun to stir. A languid morning sun cast long shadows across the stone-paved courtyard of the old Lantern Inn, lending a fleeting warmth to the crisp autumn air. Already the hush of dawn had given way to the sounds of preparation within. Pots clinked in the kitchens, chairs scraped across flagstones in the dining area, and muffled footsteps moved up and down the winding corridors. For a grand building originally intended as a hunting retreat for minor nobility, the inn now seemed both stately and faintly claustrophobic, like a faded dowager clinging to past glories, yet filled with unseen dramas in every corner. In the snug parlour at the back of the inn stood two figures, outwardly dissimilar, but bound by recent events. One was Margaret Carter, mistress of this venerable establishment, and victim of the recent theft. The other was Martin Lowe, the quiet newcomer whose polite reserve stirred much curiosity around Dunsford. Both, for different reasons, were at the heart of the puzzle that had sent the village's comfortable routine into disarray. Margaret Carter, the warm-hearted owner. Margaret Carter's presence seemed to fill the parlour with reassuring solidity. She was neither young nor old, one might place her in her early 50s, and carried herself with practical efficiency. Friendly brown eyes, lightly creased at the corners, contrasted with the deeper lines of worry now etched across her brow. Her auburn hair, starting to show strands of silver, was tucked into a neat twist, and she wore a plain yet elegant day dress, suitable for managing the inn. Having discovered her recipe book stolen and her storeroom sabotaged, Margaret had spent a restless night torn between hurt and indignation. Yet even now her posture remained steadfast, as though no calamity could truly undermine her sense of duty to her patrons. Anyone who had known her over the years would say that Margaret Carter embodied the old lantern's spirit, stalwart, generous, and unerringly loyal. She stood by a mahogany sideboard, methodically arranging cups and saucers for the day's first customers. The parlour's high-beamed ceiling and carved wainscoting offered a genteel reminder of the inn's genteel origins, yet the atmosphere felt subdued by the aftermath of the burglary. She glanced up at the tall windows, where sunlight strove to penetrate the heavy brocade curtains. "Perhaps I should leave them open wider," she murmured, half to herself, half to Martin, "to let in a bit of light. I'd hate for my inn to look as gloomy as I feel." Martin Lowe, the reserved newcomer. Leaning quietly against the doorframe, Martin Lowe inclined his head in agreement. A trim man in his early 40s with close-cropped dark hair peppered at the temples, he wore a tailored but modest tweed jacket, a garment that spoke more of function than fashion. Rumour had it he had served in military intelligence during the Great War, though no one could confirm the details. He offered few hints himself, deftly sidestepping curiosity with polite half-answers. His air of understated confidence, combined with a certain stillness of demeanour, made villagers uncertain whether to view him as an intriguing presence or a potential threat. Some speculated he had come to Dunsford on undisclosed business. Others believed he merely sought the quiet life. Now, as the theft cast suspicion in all directions, Martin found himself watched more closely than he might have wished. He moved away from the door, stepping into a rectangle of sunlight that lit dust motes dancing around him. "Gloom doesn't suit you, Mrs. Carter," he said, voice calm. "Though I understand how distressing this must be." Margaret exhaled sharply. "It's the bake-off that troubles me most. Not because of my pride, you see, but the donation. If I fail to present my best dish, there's precious little chance of winning, and that money, well, it was promised to a cause very dear to my heart." Martin's dark eyes flickered with sympathy. "I imagine it must be no small sum." She nodded, tightening her grip on a cup before placing it gently with the others. "Substantial enough to matter. Whoever did this must have known what it would cost me. Financially, yes, but also personally." A moment's silence settled, broken only by the faint hum of voices in the corridor. The inn's staff bustled about, but a heavy hush hovered in the parlour, as though the old walls themselves listened. Quiet interplay of motives. Seemingly from nowhere, Agatha Marple appeared at the threshold. She glided inside with a serene composure, her silver hair pinned neatly, a mild smile playing around her lips. One could almost miss her entrance, so soft was her tread, yet Martin and Margaret both turned to greet her, sensing her quiet authority. "Agatha," Margaret said, relief quickening her tone, "I was just, well, feeling terribly out of sorts." "Have you discovered anything yet?" Agatha offered a small, sympathetic tilt of her head. "One hardly uncovers a culprit overnight, my dear, but fresh perspectives and gentle questions often illuminate hidden corners. I thought I might see how you're faring." Martin folded his arms, unconsciously adopting the stance of a man accustomed to observation. "They say you have quite a knack for these affairs, Miss Marple," he said in a polite, measured voice. "Any immediate suspicions?" Agatha regarded him with kind but penetrating eyes. "I prefer not to trade in suspicions, Mr. Lowe. Facts, on the other hand, can be surprisingly resilient when confronted with patience." A faint curve touched his mouth, though his posture remained guarded. "An excellent approach." Margaret set down the final cup with a decisive click. "Well, if you ask me, it's likely one of my rivals for the bake-off. Anne Hathaway is a possibility. She's forever lamenting my unfair advantage. And that travelling pastry chef from up north looked rather envious of my recipes last year." She paused, her features clouding. "But then again, could it be someone from here in Dunsford? Someone I trust?" At that, Martin's eyes strayed to the sash window, as though recalling a conversation or memory unspoken. Agatha watched him in her peripheral vision, noting a subtle tension in the set of his shoulders. Was that concern, or simply a pang of sympathy? Agatha smoothed her skirt with an absent gesture. "There might be a dozen plausible motives," she said calmly, arranging from jealousy to pure spite. "We should keep open minds. I suspect there's far more to unravel than we see now. Seeds of misdirection." Margaret sighed. "I just want my recipes back, or at least the chance to recreate them properly before the festival. Whoever's behind this is callous indeed." Martin lowered his voice, offering quiet reassurance. "We'll help you, Mrs. Carter. I'm sure the rest of the Friday Night Club feels the same. This community stands by its own." Agatha noted his phrasing. "This community." A subtle distinction from our or my, perhaps underscoring his status as an outsider, but she simply smiled, letting the silence expand, before steering the conversation to the details of Margaret's routine on the night of the theft. It was in these everyday recollections, when hearts softened to speak of small, overlooked matters, that the most telling insights often emerged. Margaret recounted the day's events, preparing dough in the early afternoon, greeting a handful of travellers who checked into the inn, and locking her storeroom before retiring for the evening. Martin listened with the polite attention of someone well trained in gleaning intelligence. Agatha quietly asked about any unusual deliveries or persons loitering about. The dialogue's rhythmic back and forth seemed ordinary enough, until Margaret recalled a perplexing detail about a door left slightly ajar in the storeroom corridor. "You're certain you secured it?" Agatha prompted, her voice mild yet intent. "Yes," Margaret insisted. "I never leave that door unlocked, but after the theft it was ajar." Martin's gaze flicked briefly toward the corridor. "A detail worth noting." Agatha's eyes glinted with a ripple of wry amusement. "As I said, facts can prove most instructive." A tense atmosphere grows. Footsteps in the hall signalled the arrival of a maid setting up for luncheon service. The Old Lantern Inn's main dining room, sumptuous in oak panelling and stained glass, would soon fill with chattering patrons who remained blissfully unaware of the mysteries brewing under their very noses. Yet the sense of unease hung in the parlour, accentuated by the muffled clang of pots from the kitchens below. Margaret, fighting the weight of worry, mustered a resolute air. "I'll manage," she declared, rallying her warm, no-nonsense temperament. "It isn't in my nature to fret too long. The bake-off is only days away. I must adjust my plans if I'm to have any chance at competing." Agatha inclined her head, affording Margaret a gentle smile. "And we will do our part to see you through, rest assured." Martin gave a concise nod. "Count on it, Mrs. Carter." A quiet hush returned as Margaret excused herself to meet with her staff. Agatha and Martin lingered in the parlour's hush, their reflections caught in a large gilt-framed mirror that had once belonged to a noble family. Outside, the sun's tentative glow illuminated the inn's courtyard, and somewhere a rooster crowed late in greeting the day. Agatha broke the silence with a soft observation. "You're quite determined to help Margaret, Mr. Lowe. I find that admirable." He held her gaze, neither flinching nor rushing to fill the silence. "Everyone deserves a fair chance, Miss Marple," he said at length. "Especially in a village so fond of tradition." She allowed a small, enigmatic smile, the kind that conveyed understanding without revealing her thoughts. "Indeed." And so the stage was set. Two watchers, each skilled in reading the unspoken, now drawn deeper into the tapestry of ambition, resentment, and hidden alliances that stretched across Dunsford. The Old Lantern Inn, once a place of restful hospitality, had become a crucible for revealing the darker impulses that simmer under the surface of quiet village life. In the spreading daylight, the parlour's shadows receded. Yet the questions remained. Who had dared cross Margaret Carter? And why risk sabotage that harmed both her and her beloved charity cause? What secrets lay in Martin Lowe's past? And why had he chosen to settle here, now of all times? Above all, how would these seemingly innocent threads weave together into a pattern of motives that could only be unravelled by a keen eye and a patient heart? Agatha Marple intended to find out. A languid haze of midday sun settled over the village of Dunsford, softening the gabled rooftops into gentle outlines. The previous evening's apprehension, triggered by the theft of Margaret Carter's recipe book, lingered in the air like a faint bitter perfume. People spoke in hushed tones, eyes drifting toward the Old Lantern Inn, as though it had become the stage for a curious drama. Inside the inn's snug sitting-room, Agatha Marple took her customary seat, the warm glow of the fireplace accentuating the light silver of her neatly pinned hair. Opposite her, Lucy Spencer reclined on a worn velvet settee, a faint flush colouring her cheeks. She toyed with a small, leather-bound notebook, an artifact of her far-flung travels, and the subtle tension in her posture suggested she had a pressing story to tell. Otwin Brooks, spirited as ever, soon joined them with the buoyant energy of a man accustomed to brightening convalescent rooms. "Don't mind if I indulge in a cup, do you?" he asked, eyeing the teapot. He poured a measure and settled beside Agatha, who gave a gracious nod in reply. They were expecting Martin Lowe shortly. Ever discreet, the man had offered to check on any suspicious comings and goings at the livery stable. Yet conversation soon gravitated to Margaret Carter, the inn's proprietor. Lucy's hazel eyes sparkled with uneasy curiosity. "Margaret's victories at the bake-off, winning thrice in a row? Isn't that somewhat unprecedented for a village competition?" Dr. Brooks chuckled, a low, affable sound. "She's skilled, no question about that, and she knows exactly how to charm the judges. It hasn't endeared her to the other contestants, mind you. Some have lost to her more than once." Agatha, stirring her tea, offered a gentle observation. "If envy or wounded pride are at play, the sabotage might have been a convenient way to unseat her from her pedestal. Greed and jealousy often wear the most ordinary faces." Before Lucy could reply, Martin Lowe entered, moving with quiet precision. A draught of cool air followed him, as though he carried the crisp autumn day indoors in his tweed coat. His nod was polite, yet a flicker in his dark eyes suggested he had picked up more rumours than he cared to share outright. "You were speaking of Margaret's rivals, yes?" Martin said by way of greeting. He hung his coat on the hat-stand. "I've heard talk of Anne Hathaway complaining that Margaret's pies always seem to coincidentally match the judges' tastes. And there's that travelling pastry chef from Farnley, Mr. Tyndale, I believe, who once declared Margaret's victory a triumph of local bias." Lucy's gaze flitted between them. "Which makes either of them potential suspects, wouldn't you say?" Dr. Brooks shrugged lightly. "The question is whether sour grapes alone suffice to commit theft and sabotage." He sipped his tea, voice turning thoughtful. "And remember, anyone with a reason to direct this year's charitable donation elsewhere might feel compelled to scupper Margaret's chances." A moment's hush ensued, briefly broken by footsteps in the corridor. Then Lucy cleared her throat, clasping her notebook. This might sound unusual, but during my last trip abroad, I stumbled on something personal about someone here in Dunsford." She hesitated, as though weighing how much to disclose. "I can't quite say who yet," she continued, "but it made me realize not everyone is as they seem." She cast a brief glance at Martin, who stiffened almost imperceptibly. Agatha, observing the minute shift in his posture, took note with silent precision. Dr. Brooks, ever inquisitive, leaned forward. "Dare we ask for any hint at all?" Lucy offered a coy smile. "Let's just say a villager's name came up in a most unexpected place. I'm not certain yet whether it's relevant to Margaret's recipe book being stolen, but it caught me off guard." Martin looked as though he might interject, but instead he pressed his lips together. Agatha's gaze flicked between them, perceiving a subtle current of tension. A bristle of unsaid truth. The air felt charged in the small sitting-room, the carved panelling and thick drapes heightening an almost claustrophobic sense that secrets hovered just out of reach. Agatha then spoke with a mild humour that masked her sharper insights. "Lucy, my dear, you do have a flair for dramatic timing. One hopes this local person won't mind your discovery, should it surface at the wrong moment." Lucy's cheeks darkened a shade. Martin busied himself adjusting a cufflink. Silence stretched. For a moment the only sounds were the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen and the faint rustle of the wind beyond the window. Dr. Brooks finally broke the hush with a genial chuckle. "Enough cloak and dagger for the morning, I say. How about a practical approach? I'll see if any of my patients have noticed odd behaviour among neighbours or travelling salesmen. Folks tend to confide in their doctor." Martin nodded, recovering his composure. "And I can make discreet inquiries too," he offered, his tone even. "This might simply be a disgruntled competitor, but if Lucy's discovery links back to our saboteur, well, the bake-off may not be the only motive at play." Agatha sat back, a thoughtful expression on her face. She lifted her teacup, its porcelain rim catching a shaft of sunlight in an almost mocking gleam. "Yes, indeed," she murmured. "It appears Dunsford is brimming with motivations, rivalries, concealed identities, ambitions, One wonders how many of these threads must come together before we can see a tapestry of truth. Outside, the wind sighed through the narrow streets, tossing golden leaves against the inn's windows. Yet the real storms, it seemed, brewed within the hearts of these quietly scheming villagers. Hearts that carried pride, fear, and longing. And as Lucy's revelations settled into the unspoken tension, Agatha Marple could not help but suspect that the puzzle lay far deeper than a mere spat over recipes and ribbons. A languid September sun beamed over Dunsford's winding lanes, casting a golden hue upon the moss-covered stone walls and stained-glass windows of the village's old church. The customary bustle of market day filled the crisp air with chatter, yet an undercurrent of restlessness threaded through the crowd. Margaret Carter's stolen recipe book continued to dominate local gossip, whispered in corners and over cups of tea. Behind the heavy doors of the old Lantern Inn, Agatha Marple strolled into the small private lounge where Dr. Edwin Brooks stood by the mullioned window. Dust motes danced in a beam of late-afternoon light behind him, creating the illusion of a spotlight trained upon the amiable, ever-smiling physician. A faint frown lined his Miss Marple, Dr. Brooks said, catching sight of her approach. He gave a cordial nod, though his hand remained clasped behind his back, a display of tension, perhaps, or a sign of suppressed worry. "Have you heard that Mrs. Burton down on Maple Street insists she saw a stranger lurking about last night? She'd only revealed that much to me, I'm afraid, so I took the liberty of speaking to her father. The story is, well, quite vague." "Vagueness can hold surprising truths, Doctor," Agatha replied, her voice gentle yet laced with a subtle dryness. "But how is it you seem so agitated?" He shifted his feet, gazing out at the afternoon throng of villagers. "It's merely the bake-off. I've a personal stake of sorts. My name, after all, is tied to the local clinic I sponsor. If someone other than Margaret Carter wins, the charitable donation would be directed to my clinic." Agatha's grey eyes reflected a soft empathy. She knew that Dr. Brooks treated many of Dunsford's poorer residents at little or no charge. Still, such altruism could blend uneasily with ambition if one's own cause stood to benefit from an unexpected upset. Their conversation was interrupted by Lucy Spencer, stepping into the lounge with that brisk confidence that marked her a woman of the world, albeit newly home from her travels. "Doctor, Miss Marple," Lucy greeted, halting when she caught Dr. Brooks's uncharacteristic air of disquiet. "Am I intruding?" "No, no, dear Lucy," Dr. Brooks replied, with the practised geniality of a man pushing aside his anxieties. "We're merely discussing the bake-off. Seems the stakes have never been higher." Lucy lowered herself onto a chaise, dropping her satchel of notes at her feet. Indeed, with Margaret's recipes missing, even the most ordinary participants might fancy their chances, and if Margaret's entry is sabotaged, well, Her observation trailed off into the hush of the lounge. Thick tapestries on the walls lent a claustrophobic sense of enclosure, recalling the old Lantern's past as a hunting retreat. One almost expected to glimpse the ghost of some minor aristocrat prowling the corridors. Agatha placed a thoughtful hand against her chin. "The trouble with a large donation is that it makes victory tempting for all. Ambition in these matters can overshadow neighbourly spirit." Her kindly gaze drifted to Dr. Brooks, though her tone remained measured. "You did say you stand to benefit if Margaret doesn't win." He let out a soft sigh. "I'd be lying if I said it didn't matter to me, but sabotage, theft, I would never condone such things." A fleeting hardness crept into his voice before it receded. "It is my hope that the rightful victor, whomever that may be, earns success honestly." Lucy's hazel eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Yet you've also pointed out how trifles can become momentous in a tiny village where resources are scarce and reputations matter." "Precisely," Agatha agreed quietly. "In my experience, the difference between a trifling squabble and a full-blown crime can be alarmingly slight." For a moment the three of them lapsed into silence. The faint echo of laughter in the inn's common room seeped through the thick wooden door, a reminder of the unsuspecting patrons dining just a few paces away. Outside, the village bustled, farmers hauling crates of produce, schoolchildren racing about, a pair of merchants hawking ribbons and lace. Yet here, In the hush of the lounge, the looming question of motive pressed in as tangibly as the tapestries on the walls. At length Lucy shifted, glancing sidelong at Dr. Brooks. "You mentioned a rumour about a stranger in town. Do you think it might be connected?" He shrugged, worry tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Mrs. Burton is prone to exaggeration, but yes, she swears she saw a man in a dark coat skulking near the inn's back entrance. Truthfully, it may be nothing." Agatha's gentle voice is a perfect recipe for regret. She cast a discerning eye about the room, absorbing the interplay of fear, ambition, and determination in Dr. Brooks's posture. In some corners of the village, the bake-off donation had quietly become a heated focus, with more than one hopeful competitor dreaming of victory, and the means by which that victory might be secured. Eventually they drifted into the corridor, parting ways with polite smiles and polite words, though deeper questions lingered. In the hush of her own thoughts, Agatha considered how easily good intentions could be tainted by desperation, how swiftly pride could sour into resentment. The corridors of the old Lantern Inn, with their echo of aristocratic grandeur, felt closing in around her, as though they too recognized the mounting tension brewing within Dunsford. And outside the sun dipped subtly towards the horizon, golden fields shading into dusky amber, with money, pride, and reputations on the line. Agatha saw the shape of a conflict unfolding, a recipe for discord that might yet bubble over in the most unexpected of ways.